There's a story Jesus tells where an employer catches his manager continuing to actively cheat him, and instead of being angrier, the boss praises him for it. Read that sentence again, because it's exactly what happens in Luke chapter 16, and most people who've heard this parable in church have somehow never stopped to notice how strange that actually is. A manager gets accused of wasting his employer's assets. He gets fired on the spot, no defense allowed. And in the gap between being fired and having to leave, he goes behind his former boss's back, calls in the boss's debtors one by one, and quietly slashes what they owe, not a little, in one case cutting a debt in half. And when the boss finds out, he doesn't have him arrested. He commends him. This is one of those parables that preachers tend to speed through, because sitting in it too long raises an uncomfortable question. Is Jesus actually telling us dishonesty pays off? He isn't. But getting to what he's actually saying requires slowing down on details that get skipped almost every time this story gets told. The specific numbers involved, the specific word used to praise the manager, and where this story sits in Luke's gospel, sandwiched between two other stories about money that most people never think to connect to it. Here's the honest version of the puzzle this video is going to sit with. Bible scholars have spent centuries disagreeing about what the manager actually did to those debts. Was he cutting his own commission, erasing illegal hidden interest, or simply committing a second act of theft against his former employer? Those are three genuinely different readings, with real evidence on more than one side, and by the end you'll have seen all three laid out fairly. But there's a bigger question underneath the technical one, and it's the one Jesus actually seems to care about. Whatever the manager did with those numbers, the boss doesn't praise him for being honest. He praises him for being shrewd, a very specific word in the original Greek that shows up in some surprising places elsewhere in Jesus' teaching. And then Jesus turns to his own followers and says something that should stop you in your tracks. That people chasing their own self-interest are, frankly, better at urgency and resourcefulness than people who claim to be chasing God. That's not a defense of dishonesty. It's a challenge aimed somewhere else entirely. And by the time we get through the story, the numbers, the surrounding parables, and the sentence Jesus adds at the end about serving two masters, you'll see exactly where that challenge is actually aimed, and why it has almost nothing to do with whether it's fine to cheat your boss. Start with a detail most translations bury. This story doesn't open on its own. Luke writes, more literally than most English Bibles render it, Jesus also said to his disciples, a small phrase that ties this parable directly to what just happened in the previous chapter. Luke 15 is three back-to-back stories about lost things being found, a lost sheep, a lost coin, and the parable most people know as the Prodigal Son, all told in response to religious leaders grumbling that Jesus spends his time with the wrong kind of people. Chapter divisions make it easy to treat Luke 16 as a fresh, unrelated story. It isn't. Jesus is still in the same conversation, just turning now to address his own disciples directly, with the religious leaders still listening in the background. Here's the story itself. A wealthy man employs a manager. The Greek word is oikonomos, someone entrusted with running his household's business and financial affairs, the same root word we get economy from. This manager gets reported to his employer for wasting the man's possessions. Notice what Luke does not tell us, whether the accusation is even true. We're never shown the manager doing anything wrong before this point. We're only told he was accused. And the employer doesn't investigate, doesn't ask for an explanation. He simply summons the manager and fires him on the spot, telling him to prepare an account of his management because his position is ending. Left alone, the manager does something Luke consistently frames as a warning sign throughout his gospel. He has an inner conversation with himself. This exact pattern shows up elsewhere in Luke, and it's never portrayed as a healthy sign. The Pharisee in Luke chapter 18 stands and prays to himself. The rich fool in Luke chapter 12 talks to his own soul about building bigger barns the night before he dies. Whenever someone in Luke's gospel starts reasoning privately with themselves like this, it's usually a signal that what follows is going to be self-serving. And that's exactly what happens here. The manager weighs his options. Manual labor is out. He says plainly he isn't strong enough for it, which might mean he spent too long behind a desk to switch to physical work. Begging is out too, out of pure pride. He can't stand the shame of it. So he lands on a plan. He'll use whatever authority he has left in the short window before he's actually removed to make people who will owe him favors later. He calls in his master's debtors one at a time. To the first, he asks how much is owed, and the man says 100 measures of olive oil, roughly 900 gallons, an enormous quantity that tells you immediately this isn't some small household transaction. The manager tells him to sit down quickly and rewrite the bill to 50. To the second debtor, owing 100 measures of wheat, something like 1,000 bushels, again a serious commercial quantity, he's told to rewrite it down to 80. Notice the two numbers aren't the same percentage. 50% off the oil, 20% off the wheat. That inconsistency is one of the reasons this story has generated centuries of debate over what's actually being adjusted here. A detail we're going to come back to in a few minutes, because it turns out to matter quite a bit for figuring out what the manager is really doing. It's worth understanding the culture behind this move for a second. Debts in this world weren't tracked the way a bank statement works today. A debtor would write out their own promissory note. The bill itself was in the debtor's handwriting, not the creditor's. So the manager isn't forging documents or breaking into a ledger. He's simply telling each debtor, using an authority that technically still belongs to him until his firing is finalized, to rewrite what they owe. From the outside, to anyone watching, this looks like an act of generosity coming from the household, because the manager still carries the master's authority when he does it. Nobody receiving this discount has any reason to suspect fraud. They just experience unexpected, dramatic relief on a serious debt. It's also worth being clear about the scale involved here, because it changes how you picture this scene. These aren't small household accounts settled between neighbors. 900 gallons of olive oil and roughly 1,000 bushels of wheat are the kind of quantities that indicate serious commercial trading partners, not casual acquaintances. Whoever these debtors are, they are people with real standing in the local economy, which means the manager isn't just buying himself a favor from a random stranger. He's deliberately building goodwill with people who actually have the means, later, to take him into their own households in a similar role of trust and management. That's the real hope hiding behind his plan, not charity from strangers, but reemployment through obligation. And then, at the end of the story, something happens that tends to catch first-time listeners off guard completely. The master finds out what the manager did with his authority in those final hours. And instead of the fury you'd expect, instead of chasing him down, instead of undoing the discounts, instead of having him prosecuted, the text says the master commends the dishonest manager. Sit with that word for a second, commends. Not grudgingly tolerated. Not decided not to pursue legally. Commends. Something about what just happened earned this manager praise from the very man he'd just cost a fortune. And figuring out exactly what that something is turns out to be the whole key to this parable, which is exactly where we're headed next. Before we get into the three competing explanations scholars have offered for what actually happened with those numbers, and the specific word Jesus uses that reframes this whole story, it's worth pausing for a second. If working through a passage carefully enough to see why serious, well-credentialed scholars still disagree about it centuries later is something you find valuable, this channel does exactly that regularly, treating difficult passages as worth sitting with rather than rushing past. If that's useful to you, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. Okay, back to the manager. Because up to this point, we've only got the bare facts of the story, an accusation, a firing, a soliloquy Luke clearly wants us to read with suspicion, two debts reduced by two very different percentages, and a master who ends up praising the very man who just cost him. What we haven't answered yet is the question that's been quietly sitting underneath this whole story. What was the manager actually doing to those numbers, and why would anyone, let alone the man he wronged. Call that praiseworthy? That's where three very different scholarly readings come in. And it's worth walking through all three fairly, because each one changes what you think this story is actually claiming. The first, and probably the most commonly repeated explanation in modern sermons, is that the manager wasn't stealing further from his master at all. He was cutting out his own personal commission. On this reading, the standard practice for a manager like this was to add his own markup on top of the base amount owed, the way a broker might take a cut. If the debtor originally owed 80 measures of oil to the master, and the manager had padded the bill to 100 to pocket the difference himself, then reducing it back down to 50 would simply mean foregoing his own profit, not stealing anything further from his employer. It's a comforting reading because it means the manager isn't continuing to sin. He's just being generous with money that was arguably his own commission to begin with. The problem is that this reading has to be read into the text. It isn't actually stated anywhere in the parable. Many careful commentators have pointed out there's no explicit indication in Luke's account that the reduced amounts represent a personal commission being waived rather than the master's own principal being cut. It's an attractive theory precisely because it resolves the discomfort of the story, which is itself a reason to be cautious about it. A reading that conveniently makes an uncomfortable passage comfortable is exactly the kind of reading worth double-checking. The second theory takes a different angle, rooted in Jewish law rather than business commission structures. The Hebrew scriptures explicitly forbid charging interest to fellow Israelites, a category sometimes referred to as usury. One reading suggests that the principal being recorded in these debts secretly included hidden interest folded into the total, a common enough workaround in the ancient world to get around religious lending restrictions. On this theory, the manager isn't stealing from his master when he reduces the bills. He's stripping out interest that was religiously forbidden to charge in the first place, which would mean he's actually correcting an injustice rather than committing one, even if his motive for doing it was entirely self-serving. This theory has the advantage of explaining why the master might not be furious. Legally and religiously, the manager may have simply brought the books back into compliance, even while doing it for his own advantage. The third reading is the most uncomfortable, and it's the one a growing number of serious commentators, including the British New Testament scholar Ian Paul, find the most textually honest. The manager is simply continuing to do exactly what he was accused of in the first place. He's not correcting hidden interest. He's not foregoing a personal commission. He is, straightforwardly, giving away his master's money that isn't his to give, purely to buy himself security once he's unemployed. On this reading, there's no clever technical loophole rescuing the manager's integrity. He is exactly as dishonest at the end of the story as the accusation claimed he was at the beginning, arguably more so, since now we've actually watched him do it. And this is where the detail about the parable's humor becomes genuinely important, not just a stylistic side note. Read plainly, without trying to sanitize it. This story is closer to a rogue's tale than a moral lesson, the kind of story where an audience is meant to be scandalized and a little delighted at the same time. The way people still enjoy a clever con artist in a movie, even while knowing the con is wrong. The manager is caught, and in the very last moments available to him, he outmaneuvers everyone. His master can't easily reverse the new, lower contracts without causing a public mess and looking ungenerous to his own business partners. And meanwhile, the manager has bought himself a soft landing with people who now owe him a favor. It's entirely possible the master's reaction at the end isn't grudging tolerance at all, but something closer to a rueful, admiring laugh. The reaction of a man who's just been thoroughly and cleverly outplayed and respects the audacity of it, even as he's the one who lost money. There's a further layer to this reading worth adding. Once the discounted bills are already out in the world, in the debtor's own handwriting, reversing them isn't simple. The master would have to publicly unwind generous-looking contracts that his own former manager issued using his authority, which would make the master himself look mean-spirited and petty in front of serious business partners. undoing exactly the reputation for generosity his household has just unintentionally earned. In other words, the manager may have cornered his former employer into a position where praising the outcome is genuinely the least costly response available, reputationally speaking. That doesn't make the manager's action honest. It makes it, in the fullest sense of the word, shrewd. That reading only works, though, if you look closely at the specific word used to praise him, because it isn't a word about honesty at all. The word translated shrewd or wise is phronimos, and it's worth knowing where else this exact word shows up in Jesus' teaching, because it's not a throwaway compliment. Phronimos refers to practical wisdom, the ability to read a situation accurately and take the effective action it calls for, sometimes defined as the faculty of thoughtful, situational planning rather than abstract intelligence. Jesus uses this same word for the wise bridesmaids in Matthew's Gospel, the ones who keep their lamps stocked with oil while waiting for a bridegroom whose arrival time they don't know. He uses a closely related term in Luke chapter 12 while teaching about being a faithful steward who stays alert for his master's unexpected return. In every other place Jesus uses this word, it's tied to readiness, urgency, and acting decisively in the moment a crisis actually demands it, not to moral uprightness. That's the key that unlocks the strange line that follows. The people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. Normally, you'd expect exactly the opposite structure. The world characterized negatively. The people of the light characterized as the wise, prepared ones. Jesus flips it on purpose. He isn't praising the manager's ethics. He's pointing at something uncomfortable about contrast and urgency. People chasing purely selfish, temporary goals often display more decisiveness, more resourcefulness, more willingness to act immediately on the truth of their situation than people who claim to be chasing something eternal. This is where the parable's placement in Luke's gospel stops being incidental and starts doing real interpretive work. The Greek verb used for the manager wasting his master's possessions, diaskarpizo, is the exact same verb Luke uses one chapter earlier for how the prodigal son squandered his inheritance in a distant country. That's not a coincidence of vocabulary. Luke is deliberately linking these two stories through the same word, back to back. One son who squanders what was given to him and eventually comes to himself and returns home, and one manager who squanders what was entrusted to him and, instead of returning anything, doubles down and manipulates the situation for his own advantage right up to the very last moment he has any authority to do so. And immediately after this parable, Luke gives us a third story built on the same theme. A rich man who fails to notice the poor man Lazarus starving at his own gate and suffers eternal consequences for exactly that failure to use his resources rightly while he had the chance. 3 stories in a row, all about what people do with what has been placed temporarily in their hands, forming a sequence Luke clearly wants read together rather than chopped up by chapter breaks. That sets up the block of teaching Jesus adds right after the parable, which is really where the whole point lands. He builds a tight, parallel structure. Whoever is faithful in very little is faithful in much, and whoever is dishonest in very little is dishonest in much. If you haven't been faithful with unrighteous wealth, who will trust you with true riches? If you haven't been faithful with what belongs to someone else, who will give you something of your own? Notice the pattern underneath all 3 parallels. The thing being tested, in every single case, is what you do with something small and temporary, as evidence for what you do with something large and permanent. And that reframes the entire parable's challenge. Jesus isn't handing his disciples a loophole to imitate dishonesty. He's pointing at the manager's urgency and resourcefulness, his refusal to sit passively once he understood his situation clearly, and asking why his own followers, who claim to understand something far more permanently at stake than a temporary job, so often respond to that with less decisiveness than a dishonest employee shows while trying to save his own skin. The manager sees his crisis clearly and acts immediately, converting temporary resources into future security while he still has the chance. Jesus' challenge is, you have something actually eternal on the line, so where is your equivalent urgency? This also explains the strange, almost startling instruction that follows. Make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. Mammon, the Aramaic term Jesus uses here, treated less like a neutral object and more like a rival spiritual force with its own pull on people, is called unrighteous, not necessarily because every dollar is dirty, but because wealth itself so easily becomes something people trust and serve instead of God. And yet Jesus tells his disciples to use it anyway, deliberately, to build real relationships and generosity now, precisely because none of it is actually theirs to hoard in the first place. Everything a person manages temporarily belongs, ultimately, to someone else, which is the entire logic behind calling this parable's central figure a steward rather than an owner. The question was never whether the money technically belonged to him. It never did. The question is what you do with something you were only ever entrusted with, for a limited and unpredictable amount of time. It's worth noticing how often this exact tension shows up outside the parable too, in ordinary experience. People motivated by nothing more than short-term self-interest frequently display more urgency, more creativity, and more willingness to use every available resource than people pursuing something they claim actually matters eternally. Whole industries built on nothing but persuading people to buy things they don't need routinely out-strategize efforts built around causes with permanent, life-altering stakes. That's an uncomfortable observation, and it seems to be exactly the discomfort Jesus is pointing at. He isn't impressed by dishonesty. He's naming a gap between how urgently people act on what they believe actually matters, and it's a gap that tends to run in the wrong direction. So what does this actually leave you with? Once you've walked through all three theories about the debts, the specific word used to praise the manager, and the two parables sitting on either side of this one, the parable was never really asking whether it's acceptable to cheat an employer. On any of the three readings scholars offer, the manager's motives are self-interested at best. What Jesus is actually doing is holding up that self-interested urgency as an uncomfortable mirror. People chasing purely temporary, selfish goals often act with a decisiveness and resourcefulness that people chasing something they claim is eternal frequently fail to match. That's the challenge underneath the humor of the story. Not go and do likewise in the literal sense of the manager's dishonesty, but go and match that same urgency, aimed at something that actually lasts. And underneath that challenge sits the quieter claim that ties the whole passage together. Nothing any of us manage, money, time, position, influence, was ever fully ours to begin with. It was entrusted for an unpredictable and limited window, the same way the manager's authority over his master's accounts was always temporary and always subject to being called in. The test in this parable was never really about the size of the numbers being adjusted. It was about whether someone facing a limited window with resources that were never truly their own would act with any real urgency about what actually matters once that window closes. Whatever unrighteous wealth and true riches mean applied to your own life right now, the parable's core challenge stays the same either way. Are you responding to what's actually eternal with anything like the urgency a dishonest, cornered man showed for something merely temporary? If tracing difficult passages back to what they're actually claiming, instead of settling for the version that's easiest to sit with, is something you want more of, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which of the three theories about the debts you found most convincing. Thanks for watching.